Are we good, Tom?
We're good, yeah, we're rolling.
Hello there, it is I, Rick Priestley, again, this time to talk to you about the Lord of the Rings game. Now, this was a game I did for Games Workshop around, I think it was about the year 2000 or so. I suppose the easiest way to start is to talk about the Lord of the Rings rather than the actual game itself, because the Lord of the Rings was massive, huge in the 1970s in particular, and as I was growing up, it was the measure by which fantasy was judged. And although we were into all sorts of things, you know, as kids we read the Conan series and we read all the American imports of things like the Fritz Leiber books and so on and so forth, Paul Anderson. But Michael Moorcock was huge in the UK, but above all that, Tolkien was a towering influence, and we all were inspired by the battles and the general vision of the Lord of the Rings to create fantasy war games. I don't know if you know, but the very first fantasy miniatures range in the UK, at least, was Miniature Figurines Limited, and it was their Mythical Earth, i.e. Middle Earth range. And that was the very start of fantasy wargaming with conventional models, and that was probably the most influential range to be released, well, probably before D&D anyway. And I collected the bad guys, so I had lots of goblins and orcs and things, and my friends collected various other things. Richard Halliwell, my co-author with Warhammer, he collected the Rohirrim and the Gondorians, and another friend of mine, a friend of ours in fact, collected the dwarves and the elves and the hobbits, as it was. How I ended up with the bad guys, I don't know, because the problem with the bad guys is they're a bit, as in all war games, they're a bit on the rubbish side. So you needed more of them, which meant you needed to spend more money. Well, I didn't have all that much money, you know, I was a kid and it was the 1970s, and you know, we weren't all that wealthy, so I struggled in the face of massed ranks of the Rohirrim, but nonetheless we had some fantastic games, and it inspired us to start writing our own war games as much as anything else. So I trace my history as a games designer right back to that time. I have very fond memories of playing Lord of the Rings. Later on, once I started working for Games Workshop, we took on various licenses, and I think it was in it might have been the mid-80s, it might have been about 1985, something like that. We acquired the license to do the Lord of the Rings. I think it was based off the Iron Crown Enterprises role-playing game license. I think we had a sub-license for that, and we produced, Citadel Miniatures produced a whole range of models for the Lord of the Rings, some of which were quite exciting. You know, they were quite nicely sculpted, and a few I would convert into early Warhammer 40k models. So my Inquisitor was a conversion of the Mouth of Sauron, for example, which I think was Bob Naismith model. A fantastic model, very, very sort of evil and sinister, and not at all like it's described in the book, but that was often the way in those days. Often figure designers would get hold of the idea rather than the literal description. So there you are. Lord of the Rings was sort of in my DNA, and even to this day, you know, I collect the books that Christopher Tolkien has written, the sort of History of Middle Earth series, and I've read most of it. So I've read most of what Tolkien wrote, and I've read a great deal of what Christopher Tolkien wrote. Fast forward to it'd be about the late 1990s, very end of the 1990s. I think we learned that there was going to be a Lord of the Rings film. Now at that time, Games Workshop was selling Warhammer and 40k, and was struggling really to kind of identify what its capabilities were in terms of supporting other games. And it had got to a position where we'd almost given up on releasing what we sometimes call specialist games or secondary games or other games.
So these are things like Mordheim, Battlefleet Gothic?
Yeah, Mordheim, Battlefleet Gothic. Examples of those things include Mordheim, Battlefleet Gothic, but also Talisman,
Sure.
Blood Bowl, which was board-based games. But they could be anything. Gorka Morka we did, and then there's the whole Epic series, for example. And those things had sort of fallen by the wayside, and the problem was that compared to the turnover that we generated by doing projects for 40k, all these things were less valuable. You could spend a week doing work on sculpting models for 40k, put them into the range and they would generate so much income. You spent the same week doing something for Epic and it would generate hardly anything. So increasingly, the sales companies felt that they were wasting their time. That's perhaps a little cruel. That they were more interested in selling 40k and Warhammer, basically 40k, than they were anything else. And eventually this would actually kill Warhammer, because 40k became so dominant that the traditional version of Warhammer was regarded as being unsupportable, and that was taken out of production, and Age of Sigmar was produced in its stead, which is a much lower commitment game, although it's gone full circle now with a new version of Warhammer. But it was, at the time, it was very tricky. But this Lord of the Rings game came. This Lord of the Rings film came up, and basically no one at Workshop was really looking at it. There was a general feeling that no, that's not what we do. We're not interested in anything that we don't own the IP for. We've got to concentrate on 40k and Warhammer because they're the only things we can really sell. So there was no enthusiasm internally at all to pursue a license for this thing. And I was looking at it. We're hearing a little bit about Peter Jackson's project and everything. And I thought, well, I think if anyone is going to do a game for Lord of the Rings, and somebody will take the license for it, then it ought to be Games Workshop, because nothing defines fantasy wargaming like Lord of the Rings. It was the beginning of fantasy wargaming. It has been a constant. It was a massive cultural influence, and that film is going to be huge. It's something which I personally had a lot of enthusiasm for, but I also felt that it was something that the company would benefit from hugely. You didn't necessarily want somebody else to be doing that game. What if some relatively well-appointed but modest figure company were to take that license on and do something with it? That could really undermine Games Workshop's position. It's to enable somebody else to get a foot on that ladder. And there were plenty of people who could have done that. So I thought, well, we should do it because we should do it if anyone's going to do it. And if anyone's going to do it, I would like to do it, because I really, really wanted to do it. I thought, well, you know, as a project, it was something that I really was quite passionate about. But nonetheless, you know, you have to put the company first and all that. And I think I was in the kitchen actually making a cup of tea, as you do, when Andy Jones came in. And Andy Jones was he's kind of our licensing man, or Project Supremo at the time. And I said, you know, I'm a bit disappointed no one seems interested in Lord of the Rings. And he looked at me and said, yeah, I think we should do it. I said, well, I think we should do it. I said, okay, well, why don't we get something together? So me and Andy got together, and we basically came up with a bit of a proposal, and we took that to the rest of the exec, and we kind of persuaded them that it was worth a go, worth a look at. The concept really was that if we went for Lord of the Rings, it would open up a new market for us very quickly, and it would enable us to recruit a younger player base and expand that player base very rapidly, and from that, they would become Games Workshop gamers. And so it was a way of expanding the business in a way that we couldn't otherwise do. It's kind of important, really. And that was the pitch. So what we did, once we got the go-ahead to at least approach New Line Cinema. New Line Cinema are the license holders for the Lord of the Rings films. We got a little proposal together. Andy obviously got in touch and made some arrangements. We were quite pleased to find they hadn't already sourced a license like this. And we did some mock-ups of what we thought the models could be out of our current ranges. And I think the Perrys might have made some models.
Yeah, they did a few. I'm trying to remember one.
There might have been little goblins from the...
Some goblins, and I think they might have done some elves as well, possibly.
Could have done from initial stills that we'd seen of the film.
And it was a very quick turnaround.
Oh yeah, it was almost instant, yeah.
Yeah, it was like 2-3 days they had to do it.
Yeah, well that's the Perrys for you. They certainly can do that sort of thing. And the Perry style, being slightly more realistic, I think suited the subject. But anyway, they did that. And we went, I think John Blanche might have done some drawings as well, and things like that. And we went over to New York. I think there were about 4 or 5 of us. There was definitely me and Andy, and I think John Blanche, and I'm sure that Chris Prentice, who would at that time be, he might have been the managing director at that time. At least us 4 went over on a plane to New York, and we pitched to David Imhoff. David Imhoff was the guy in charge of all the licensing at New Line. Very, very posh New York offices, very slick, all suits and dead smart. You know, it was like something out for TV. Yeah, it was quite an eye-opener, really. We turn up, you know, looking like we do. And I think they were quite intrigued, because when you're doing toy licensing or game licensing, they tend to think in terms of, you know, Hasbro and, you know, the big toy manufacturers. And we turn up with these little toy soldiers and explain about the game and all that, and they go, "Oh, we never knew there was such a thing. How bizarre." Well, yes. And I think what appealed to them about it was the fact that it enabled them to basically have a little license for something they wouldn't otherwise have really thought of. When you're doing licensing off big IP for films and things like that, what you look to do is slice the license as thinly as possible. That means you don't just have a toy license, you have this kind of toy license and that kind of toy. So you can do the 12-inch figures, you do the collectible 3-inch figures.
Hasbro can still do their thing. And,
yeah.
you know.
Exactly, they do it. It doesn't stop anyone else doing then the board game and all that sort of thing. So we said, well, why don't you give us a license for tabletop wargaming? And said, because we don't know what it is. So we almost like invented the slice for them. And they were very happy with that, because, you know, they didn't expect to get much off it. It would be a little tiny thing, but, you know, it's all extra, it's all bunts, isn't it? And that's what they like to do. And their usual model is you do a license, Hasbro, whatever, they do the toy's released with the film, it sells quite well, you get some license royalties off it, and then that's it. That's the usual model. With us, that's what they expected, I suppose. But it all happened. We got the license. It was quite a good license insofar as it allowed us to make anything based on the film at the time. And remember that there was only 1 film being made. There were going to be 3, but the license was for the first one. Subsequently, the licenses are extended to the others, but you couldn't actually license something that wasn't in that film. So it was the film, not the book. That was interesting. Having got the thing rolling, we looked at what we could do at Games Workshop, and at the time, all of our figure design, well, in fact, all the designers for everything were already kind of committed to all the projects. So it was very convenient from my point of view because I wanted to do this as a project. I had an idea of how to do it, and there was no one else to do it. Hooray! So I get to do it. So I start thinking about the game. Meanwhile, we start to get stuff back from New Line Cinema. Now, at this time, New Line Cinema are getting stuff from LOTR, who are the company in New Zealand who are making all the props and pieces, and the production company from Peter Jackson. So we're getting stills from the shot, and at one point we get an opportunity to, actually it's when we were in New York on one, it might have been the second time we went over, they basically said, well, you can't take any of this information away from you, but I'll just go in the other room and left us with all of these basically shots and stills and scripts and things. And so we can't give you any of this, but you know, you just look at it. Left the room, and then we started clicking photographs, which we technically weren't supposed to do, but they were obviously understood. And
there's no other way around it, really, is
no,
there?
there wasn't. And but at the time, the scripts were secret, and the production stills were all top secret. The non-disclosure agreements were ferocious.
I remember the Perry twins were telling me that when they were sculpting the models, they
Yep.
were in a separate room.
Yeah, we had to set up a separate little studio. It was on the ground floor, actually. It was away from the main studio with a padlock, one of these key locks on, that you could only get in if you were one of that team. And all the sculpting, all the referencing was kept in that room under lock and key. And everything to do with that movie was basically secret from the rest of the company. You couldn't just wander in. It was, yeah, well, I could, but you know, no one else could. And I was working on it in my office, but you know, it was just I didn't need that kind of material. It was the visual referencing, really. It was the thing. And we understood that the film was going to be about the Fellowship of the Ring, so it was about the first book of the Lord of the Rings. I've got that in my head, so I didn't have any problems. But we understood too that certain things were different. But New Line didn't necessarily know what was different and what wasn't different. So the information that got fed to us was quite tricksy. I think we knew Tom Bombadil wasn't in it, but we didn't necessarily know where they'd got substitutions for one character or another. Like Arwen takes the place of Glorfindel at the crossing of Rhoros. We didn't know that, and so on. So there were things that we had to find out, and usually you found them out quite late in the process. But which was entertaining. So, but
Kept you on your toes.
yeah, it was definitely quite tricky, and the problem was that New Line were being very, very cautious with the information they gave out. LOTR were being cautious with the information they gave to New Line, and eventually we got a direct link, and our guys were able to talk to the LOTR guys. And actually, once we got that going, I think the fact that we were kind of craftsmen, hands-on people, and they were craftsmen, hands-on people, made it much easier. And
Like the Perry twins,
Yeah.
Brian Nelson and Alessi
Yeah.
went out, didn't
they went out there and took part in the filming. I think it might have been
they?
the
That's the third one.
was it the third one, yeah, because
They did sculpting like with Peter Jackson.
Yeah,
and,
yeah. Richard at WETA, I can't remember his surname. Yeah, who I did meet on occasions. Yeah, so the relationship became quite tight. But initially it was all through New Line, and that kind of was the phase where I was involved, really. So I started working on the game system. We can't playtest the game in-house because we can't, it's got to be secret. So we actually started doing all the playtesting around at Alan Perry's house. And we set up the games and play them there, and I come up with a system that's basically, I know we can't have a proper battle game because there are no proper battles in the first film. Everything's got to be based on the first film. So I know it's got to be a skirmish. It's got to involve, well, it's got to involve the 9 Fellowship, tick. What else has it got in it? Well, we know it's got the scene in Moria, so we've got those elements. And we know it's got the scene in Lothlorien afterwards, so we've got some elves as well. And that's about it. I think there's a scene right at the beginning of the film where they do a flashback to the Battle of the Gladden Fields where the ring is lost.
Yeah.
that's helpful because it's got some kind of armour details of the elves and everything in it. So that enabled us to make enough for a game, but it would have to be a certain type of game. It would have to be a man-to-man skirmish war game. So I start to evolve it. Given that this is going to be a game that's going to be picked up by people who don't know what a war game is, I pitch it on that level. So it's an intuitive system. And I think this is the first book, that one. And at the time, I thought it was a really stripped-back system, you know, no nonsense, say it like it is. Something that somebody could pick up, maybe a young teenager or even, you know, 8, 9, 10-year-old could pick up and actually get the hang of very quickly. The basics being quite simple, but structured in a fairly intuitive way. When I went back and reread it, I was surprised how complicated it was. I obviously couldn't help myself, but on the whole, I would say that it is a fairly intuitive system and a very, it's a very different kind of system. It's a break from Warhammer or 40k. And one of the things that makes it particularly interesting is I took that traditional I go, you go system, or alternating turns, and introduced that idea of initiative in each turn. So although it was alternating, it would always be an A player and a B player, you never knew whether you were going to be A or B. And that was interesting, gave it a different dynamic, which really underpinned the game. And then the other trick was trying to find a way of making the heroes genuinely heroic without just statting them up. And I did that with the 3 special characteristics. I think it's might, will and fate. And these are essentially, might is essentially bonuses that you add to rolls until you've used up. Will is basically a number of rolls you get to either cast or resist magic. And fate is a kind of saving throw that you can use. It's a 4, 5, 6 saving throw that you can use against a wound. So those 3 things, taken in combination with the stats, really stretch the way the game works. And that's the fellow. That is the box that we did for it, for the Fellowship of the Ring. These are the metal figures, I believe.
Yeah, they're the original ones.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I mean, obviously, I didn't have a lot to do with the miniatures. The miniatures were, as I say, done in a secret squirrel room, mostly by the Perrys and by. I'm trying to think who else worked on it.
Yeah, I think Brian Nelson, Gary Moore.
He did, yes. All the usual crew had a bit of a go at it.
I think Chris Fitzpatrick might have done some as well.
Oh, was he still with us at the
I
time?
think he was, yeah.
If so, he might have done, yeah.
Because I know he did some fantasy stuff after
Yeah.
the release of Fellowship of the Ring, so he might have been involved, but
Yeah. Well, I think everyone was at some time or other.
sure, yeah.
Yeah, but it was, we had to still keep going with Warhammer and 40k, obviously. So it was tricksy. It was more difficult finding out what to make than it was making it, as you might expect. As I was developing the game, I also was in touch with my friend Stefan Hess in Germany, and he'd helped me develop Warmaster. And he came up with a little computer program for calculating how various types of hero or troops would fare against other types, which was very useful. Yeah, there was one which called the Goblin Calculator, and it was basically how many goblins can this character kill before he's overwhelmed.
Sure.
And it was really interesting because you only had to just change one parameter, and suddenly it went from 60 to 120. You know, it was quite good. It was a way of being able to get an idea of the balance of the game without having to play thousands and thousands of iterations of the game, because obviously you can't do that. And we were a bit limited. We could only play test it amongst people that were in the know. Although we did.
This would be happening outside of work as well, I would imagine.
I think at that time, because it was a work project, we might have been able to take the odd afternoon out and do it then. Yeah. Which would, yes, in fact, I'm sure we did that. And the Perrys did, the great thing about the Perrys is they have a very intuitive understanding of how a war game works. They're not mad keen on complicated or involved rules, but they pick things up quite quickly. So it all seems, and they have, as I say, intuitive understanding. So they tend to do things very intuitively. One of the ways you design a game is to come up with the basic rules and then watch people play. And when they come to a situation then where they don't really know what to do, they tend to do two different things. One is they'll look at you and go, what do I do? And the other is they just do something intuitively. Because the parents just do something intuitively, as a games designer, I'm able to go, that's interesting. I'll write that down.
And then take the credit, yeah.
Well yeah, ultimately, yes. Because that's how it works. If they look at you and go, what do I do next? You go, oh, I'm not really sure, actually. Good question. And then you have to discuss it. And it's not quite... and really, it's much better if the intuitive thing is the rule.
It just feels natural.
It just feels natural. It's what people will do. Whereas a lot of time, you're evolving rules in your head, and the internal logic will dictate what the step is. But the internal logic can sometimes be illogical if you're doing it personally. You know, it can suddenly appear counterintuitive. So it's a way of designing rules that I've always advocated and would always recommend. So we did that. Anyway, we got it done. There were a few little hiccups along the way. The one I remember in particular was with Aragorn's sword, Anduril, because in the books, because I knew the books like the back of my hand. What's that? I knew the books like the back of my hand. And in the book, Anduril is given to Aragorn at the start of his quest, at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, when they all leave Rivendell. It's reforged, it's given to him. It's a symbol of him making his play to be King of Gondor and recover the crown of Elendil. So it's massively symbolic within the film, within the book. Within the film, they change it. And the reason why it threw me was I couldn't understand why they'd change it. Because it seemed like it's one of the key things in the book. It's one of the key things. And they change it. It doesn't make sense. And it never occurred to me. Because not seen the film. Bear in mind, none of us had seen the film. The film didn't exist until way after we'd done all this. And I kept writing up the stats for Aragorn and including Anduril, because why wouldn't you? And they kept sending it back and going, oh no, that won't work. And I'm going, well, is it the rules for Anduril they think won't work? Is it the rule that's inappropriate?
They're not telling you why it won't work.
Yeah, they're not telling me why it won't work.
Telling you it won't work.
Yeah. And it probably what is happening is it's going to New Line. New Line is sending it to Peter Jackson or one of his team. And one of his team's going, oh, we don't have Anduril. No, this won't work. Yeah, sure. And the guy's going, no, we can't. And it's like by the time it's getting to us, it's Chinese whispers. It took 3 goes, back and forth, weeks at a time, before eventually they said, he doesn't get Anduril until the second movie. And I'm going, oh, well, that's all right then, I can go with that. And I just changed the rule for Anduril and gave it to Aragorn personally. Can't remember what it's called, but you know, so it made no difference to the game at all. But weeks and weeks of messing around. I do remember that. One of the people that helped with this massively was Alessio, because Alessio's a big Lord of the Rings fan. And he like me, can I be involved? Can I be involved? And so it was great. It was great having another games designer on board as well. And when we did the second one, basically we did this one together, if I remember right. This is the second one, 2 Towns. Yeah, by Alessio Cavatori and Rick Priestley. The game rules, that is. I mean, it's actually worth pointing out that in both these cases, a good chunk of these books is all hobby material, which was the other thing, of course, because you're trying to pitch this to people who don't necessarily understand what all Warhammer and 40k players understand about making your own kit and painting.
To paint rather than playing.
Yeah, exactly, and scenery projects and things like that. So all the extra stuff in these books is great. What made it all work, as much as the my contribution was just the games design. In fact, this book, where does it start? Ooh. There. So, you know,
It's a good half of the book.
yeah, a good chunk of it is extra hobby material. I couldn't find a copy of the third book when I came to doing this little video, which that's because I think basically Alessio wrote it, and I think I might have helped him out, but chances are I would just have been there as a sort of a mentor for him if he wanted.
Hand in the reins
Yeah.
kind of thing for it.
Yeah, so the reins got out, and so it's quite possible that when they came to give out the freebies, I didn't get one. Which seems mean, doesn't it? There you go. Yeah, so in the meantime, what happened was Andy Jones, God bless him, negotiated a part work. We'd done part works before, and Lord of the Rings was very, very popular in Games Workshop. It achieved everything we wanted it to achieve. It sold through really well. It established itself particularly well in countries like Italy and France and Spain, where the Warhammer and 40k markets were less mature, it's smaller. So we were very happy with it, and on the whole, it was a success. Then we did a part work, and when we did the part work through D'Agostini, it went through the absolute roof. You know, it was just a nightmare, but it was a nightmare in many ways keeping up. But the problem with part work became, because it was TV advertised and pushed and sold tremendously well, again, massive success, the demand for the Lord of the Rings within the Games Workshop sales environment just went stratospheric, and suddenly our shop staff and the retail, the trade guys, all the sales teams were suddenly fighting customers off. And for a while, they stopped selling anything. They didn't have to sell because it sold itself. And they kind of got out of the habit. We started to, because there was so much money sloshing around, particularly in places that weren't used to it, like in Italy, they thought, well, this is great. We'll employ more staff and we'll have more guys in the stores, particularly guys, you know, to show people how to play, because, you know, they don't need to be able to, it sells itself, doesn't it? So we expanded the staff, lots of hobby staff within the stores. We expanded the headquarters in some cases. The Italians famously moved into these new block of offices with marble floors and all this fancy gear. Yeah. And money was spent, and expenses went up and up and up and up. And it was just it was one of those things where it was building up trouble, because what happened, of course, is that down the road, once the Lord of the Rings films were over, and once the D'Agostini part works had kind of faded out,
The hype is kind of...
the hype's gone.
Yeah.
And suddenly it tails off. Well, it tails off to quite a good level as it happens, but the expense of running Games Workshop was now way, way higher. And it became a major problem. And part of that was because we'd suddenly filled all the shops with staff who weren't being trained to sell. They were just being trained to kind of demo games and show people how to paint and all that sort of thing. The companies that had grown very rapidly had just expanded their staff, expanded their whole operation, without having the solid base to support that. So suddenly the profit turns into loss. And meanwhile, had their 40k Warhammer gone for boil? Probably not, but they certainly weren't going to be replacing that massive sale, bulge that we'd got. Now, originally, when we talked about this as a project, we all understood, it was understood right at the top, that this was going to be a bulge. It was going to be the sales will lift up and then they'll drop back, and hopefully they'll continue on a higher kind of gradient. So it's a way of gaining sales, but it's not a way of going like that. The sale curve was never going to go like that. It was always going to go like that. But it didn't even do that. What it did was it went and then and started to drop. And this became a real problem for Games Workshop management, because they managed the message very poorly to the city, and they managed internally very poorly by, it basically wasn't my responsibility, but the sales companies were allowed to put on extra cost. They were allowed to do a lot of these things. They were given a lot of autonomy, whereas in reality they needed to be told what to do. You get the same problem sometimes with launches of games where we have just to go off on one for a minute. We had a similar problem with Gorka Morka. Gorka Morka was a secondary game, an extra game. It's one of these things we do in between the main release. So it was never going to be massive compared to 40k, because nothing ever is. But it would do all right, and then it would fade out, like they all did. That was just the way again. That's just a pattern. It's how all products work. And because by now the sales teams were allowed to set their own print runs, which previously had been done in the studio by me talking to people, but now the sales companies were setting their own print runs, and they just went berserk, and they just printed way more than they could sell, on the basis that they were salesmen. And salesmen are always, yeah, give us more, we'll sell it. That's the sales mentality. And what happened was they sold loads. It was the best-selling game on launch that we'd released up until that point. But it was still only half what the guys had anticipated selling. So it became a massive overstock. And that's kind of what happens when you give people autonomy within businesses like this, without necessarily providing the safety net for them. And that's what happened with Lord of the Rings. And that drop-off in sales, followed by that catastrophic readjustment while we coped with having to cut costs back to a realistic level, was commonly known as the Lord of the Rings effect. The Lord of the Rings effect was seen as a very bad thing, and it just shows you how bad it is doing things like the Lord of the Rings, and how we should just stick to doing Warhammer 40k and Warhammer, mostly 40k of course. And I thought that was a terrible message. And I used to refer to it as the shite management effect, which I don't think helped my career prospects greatly. But it's true. It was badly managed. And over the years, one thing I've noticed about Games Workshop, we were fantastic at managing a crisis. A poor situation could be turned around brilliantly. We were shite at managing success, and particularly success like that. I just thought it was a terrible message to give. It was basically kind of like pulling in and going, no, we'll stick to this. We'll stick to 40k and what we know. God plays the Emperor. And ultimately they did that, probably what they did for quite a while after. Yeah. So my experience with Lord of the Rings was kind of like very mixed in a way, because it started off quite a reasonably modest but practical expectation. It kind of went mad, which at the time I thought was fantastic. You know, it was seen as being a great success. Then it was seen as being a disaster, and I thought, okay. But the disaster itself had implications for the whole way in which Games Workshop's senior management looked at the way the product was developed, which again was something that impacted on me quite a bit. And I think, which, as I say, is a bit of a shame, really. And I don't know an awful lot about how Lord of the Rings has been supported afterwards. I know that there were two things we did. We did The Hobbit. Now, again, I think me and Andy Jones went over to California to see Laura Battle at Tolkien Enterprises. And this was to get the literary license, because we thought if we extended the game to cover what was in the literary license, we could add in, I'd say Tom Bombadil, but you know, anything and everything that's in the books that isn't in the films, we could then expand, and it would allow us to expand the imagery as well. Which we did. So that enabled us to build the game further and include The Hobbit, if I remember right. Yeah. So we did then. I think The Hobbit. I think we did something for The Hobbit before The Hobbit film, didn't we? I can't remember. I think we did, but anyway, I think The Hobbit film came along, and there was a certain feeling that it would be The Lord of the Rings again. Let's do it again. And I remember Andy Jones coming to me and talking to me about The Hobbit and being very upbeat about it and saying, it's going to be 3 films and it'd be like Lord of the Rings again. And I looked at him, I said, it's The Hobbit, Andy. You know, this is like, yeah, Lord of the Rings is great, but The Hobbit, you know, you've done The Lord of the Rings. Let's do.
Step down, isn't it?
It's a step down. Let's do something for the Hobbit movie, but let's not go mad. And I think we did go mad, but you know, they were again. They thought, oh, okay. I think my talking it down a bit was they didn't like that. There's a lot of groupthink at Games Workshop, as you might imagine. But I thought we ought to be careful with the Hobbit because you know there's no way. And meantime, because we'd got the Hobbit license, in fact, yes, because we'd got the literary license for the Hobbit, we were obliged to use it. And because I thought we shouldn't do something for the 28mm game straight away, I did a development of the War Master system and created a game called The Battle of the Five Armies, which enabled me to do, again, it's a little bit of a pushing a personal agenda because it's something I really wanted to do. It was almost like how I imagined the War Master game originally being released, with plastic figures and two armies in a box, big box, yeah. And that was reasonably successful. I also used it as a test bed for making plastic scenery.
It's quite a collector's game now.
Yeah, well, it wasn't so, it was one of those things that didn't sell particularly well because they didn't sell it particularly well.
Sure.
It was almost like, okay, we've got it, let's put it in the shops, right, it's sold, let's not, and I'd go into a shop and say, oh, now you've got the Lord of the Rings game not on display. They'd say, oh no, we sold it. Oh, did you only have the one? Yeah, we only have the one. You're going to order it again? Oh, I don't know. Really? At one point, they were selling them under the counter in brown paper bags. I kid you not. We've been told not to put these on display. Yeah, fine, great. But it was a nice project. I don't know, the plastics for it are quite nice.
Was the rule set much different to War Master, or is it?
No, hardly at all. It's essentially an iteration of War Master. Trying to think if there's any rules differences. I don't think there are really. It was an updated version of the game, so it was a slightly better version because the original War Master, because I was so determined to not use mechanics from Warhammer, there were some things about it that were slightly quirky that didn't quite work, in particularly the system for whether you charge the front or the side or whatever, depending on how you were angled against something. That could be exploited, particularly by flying creatures, in ways that were quite bizarre. And I didn't twig at the time, which just shows you really, because I'd been playing it and playtesting it for ages. So that changed. But otherwise it was essentially the same. Yeah, that was good fun. And yeah, and it had scenery in it and plastic bits and pieces and everything. So I did do that, and that was good fun. I think that's about it really. I think once Alessio took over the sort of chief Lord of the Rings, the ring bearer for the system, or perhaps the Dark Lord, then I stepped away from it. Alessio and I always had a quite good working relationship. I think he kind of looked to me, perhaps to Jervis as well, but to me as a mentor. And if he wanted to talk over a rule or a sort of approach to something or something he wanted to do, he'd often come to my office and we'd chat over it. We'd put some toy soldiers on the table and just go over it. Whereas the guys who did Warhammer and 40k, which would be Gav Thorpe or Andy Chambers, they didn't tend to do that. I think what they tended to do was go to Jervis and do similar things. They'd run things past Jervis, who was in the studio still. Although they were always welcome to come and talk about stuff, but they tended not to. So I did continue to have a bit of a sense of what the Lord of the Rings was doing. But other than that, now I then stepped on and did all the projects. So that's really all I've got to say about Lord of the Rings. Unless you can think of something.
No, I got nothing. No.
Okay, well let's wind it up there then.
Yeah, lovely.
Right. Cheerio.